So now that we have access to identity, let's go and configure some seed users in our application. So let's open up our seed.cs class. And what we're going to do in here is we're going to add our user manager so that we can actually create some new users. And what I'll do is I'll specify user manager, and we need to pass in our app user entity to this as well as the type, and then we'll just call it user manager. And we'll need to bring in ASP.NET Core identity. And what we'll do is, first of all, we'll just do the same as we did for our activities. We'll check to see if we have any existing users. Now, because we're using the user manager in this case, what we can do is add the not operator and say user manager dot users, and then we can check to see if there are any users in our user store. And if there are not, then what we're going to do is create a new list and say var users equals a new list, and it's going to be a new list of app user. And in here what we'll do is we'll say new app user, and for the display name we'll call this user Bob, and the username we'll just call it Bob as well in lowercase, and for the email address we'll just set this to bob@test.com. And we don't need to add any of the other properties inside this. This is enough to create our new user. And for each user we'll just use a standard password to make it easy to test our users and log in our users, etc. So what we'll do is we'll just add a comma, and then I'm just going to copy this new user 2 more times and just reformat this a tiny bit. And for our second user we'll just call this user Tom, and username of Tom, and make the email tom@test.com. And the third user we'll just call Jane, username of Jane, and we'll set the email to jane@test.com. And then what we can do is we can say for each and say var user in users, and what we can do here is say user manager, and what we want to do here is create a new user. And the create method in here is an async method. There's no synchronous method here, so we'll need to swap our seed method to be asynchronous as well. We don't have to, it'll still work using this, but it'll just run synchronously, and we'll just see some warnings somewhere in our application. So we'll use the create async, and then we need to pass in our user, the user that we want to create here. So I'll specify user, and then we need to provide a string of the password. And for our password we actually need to provide a strong password here. If we attempt to create users with a weak password, we'll get an error and they simply won't be created. So the password I'm going to use is PA$W0RD, and this will meet the complexity requirements of our password. Now, because we're using the user manager here, this is going to create the specified user in the backing store, which means we don't need to save our changes via our data context. This is automatically going to save our user into our user store and therefore into our database as well. Now, because we're using this create async method, let's make this an asynchronous method. And what we'll need to do, instead of returning void, we'll need to return an async task in this case. And I'll bring in system threading tasks. And then what we'll need to do is use the await operator here. I'll not change the other method because this is only going to be run once when we start our application, and then it's not run again until we restart our application. So this doesn't make a great deal of difference whether it's async or not. So what we also need to do is go to our program class and make some additions to that. So I'm just going to open up the program.cs class, And inside here, we're getting an error and we're getting a warning. And the error is because we need to pass in our user manager instance to our seed data method, because we need to pass also the user manager to this. So what we'll need to do is say var user manager equals services.getRequiredService, and then we need to specify the user manager and pass in the app user as the type in there. And we'll also need to bring in ASP.NET Core identity, and we'll also need to bring in the domain as well. And then we can pass our user manager to our seed data method. And the warning is telling us that because this call is not awaited, the current execution of the current method continues before the call is completed. And what we can do is, because we're not in the context of an async method here, we can use the wait function instead of awaiting this particular call. Now what we should be able to do is restart our application, and this should then run our seed method and add our 3 new users into our application. So I'm just going to stop the application and restart it. And let's go take a look at our database again. And if we open the ASP.NET users and show table, then we can see that we now have our 3 users added to the database. Now, they've all been given IDs that are GUIDs, and because we didn't change the type of ID from the default, which is this string, to anything else, then that's what we get. We get our username and a normalized version of the username, our email address and a normalized email. And even though we use the same password for all 3 users, note that they all have different password hashes. And that means if our database was to be compromised, then the evil hacker would then have to go and figure out and compute the result of this based on various techniques such as using rainbow tables and various other very compute-intensive techniques to effectively try every combination of characters that would work with that password hash, or to get that password hash from a salted and hashed password. And whilst I'm not saying that's impossible, I don't know how to do it, and it would not be worth the effort, because for each of these expensive calculations, they would only get 1 user's password, and by the time they retrieved that, then in theory you would have been able to notify the users that they need to change their passwords. And we also get various other information in here as well, including some flags to say if the lockout is enabled, if the account is locked out, and we've also got our display name in here as well. So now that we have some users, what we're going to take a look at next is adding a login handler so our users can actually log in to our API.